We are so excited that each of you have joined us. We just have a few housekeeping things. We ask that you please mute your lines and use the chat function for questions. We will try and address all questions before the end of the session. Just as a reminder, all sessions are being recorded. Please mute, like I said, and click the chat icon and select all panelists and attendees and enter your name and organization so we have an idea of where you're coming at us from. Each of you should have received a whiteboard, paddle, and marker in the mail. If you find something inspiring, exciting, or new, write a quick adjective on the whiteboard and hold it up during our Q&A time when you come off of video. As you all just have gotten the last privilege to listen to Sarah, we're going to go a little deeper into different things here. And Sarah, I just want to turn the floor over to you. We're so excited you have joined us today.
Excellent. Thanks, Katie. Oh, it is so good to be doing this breakout session. This is my favorite part because this is where we get into the deeper work. And I think all of us are kind of hungry for this deeper work. I mean, I could be wrong, but let me know if everybody else is hungry for this deeper work. It seems to me that a lot of what we do, because so much of it is via Zoom video, that we are kind of missing that deeper connection to talk to each other and make things, I don't know, more real, I guess, because we're not in person as much as we would like to be. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're just going to jump right in here. Hopefully you downloaded the worksheet that came with this on the Hooba, however you pronounce that platform. It is like a spreadsheet. And it is going to be your story portfolio that we're going to start working through today, right now. And anytime you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box. And Katie has agreed to read that to me. I don't keep the chat box open because I get too distracted. As I mentioned in the first session, I have activator and adaptability in my top strengths. So distraction is a real issue for me. And so I'm going to ask Katie to just keep an eye on that chat box for any questions or comments that come in. So it was it was 2019, and I was at the No Longer Virtual Conference, the summit that I put together every year. And this happened to be the third one. And it was in Atlanta, in Buckhead. And I will never forget the first interaction I had with some of my guests. I had gone out to the grocery store to get some snacks because my husband was with me and he was going to be working from the hotel room while I was hosting this conference. And we were coming back and it was pouring down rain. And I got a text message from one of my participants that I'm particularly close with, Melissa Hughes. And she said, "Sarah, where are you? We're waiting for you in the hotel lobby bar." And my heart just burst. I was so excited and picked up the pace. Obviously it was raining, so I was already walking pretty fast. My husband and I got in. I asked if he could take the groceries up and if he would mind if I stayed and had a glass of wine with these ladies. And he said, "No, of course not." So he went into the hotel, went to his room. And as I walked into the hotel, the lobby bar was actually right inside the big rotating door of the Intercontinental Hotel. And right inside the door was this low table and 4 high back chairs. They looked almost like thrones. And these women were right there as I walked in the door. And all 3 of them that had been sitting there stood up and came running over to hug me. These big, fierce, real hugs. I felt so good in that moment. They didn't care that they were getting wet because I was wet from coming in from the rain. And the 4 of us sat together and just started visiting. Now you'll see these images on the screen. You see Kimberly Davis is in the top center, and she wrote the book Brave Leadership, and it had been published earlier that year, late in 2018, I think. And then to the left, you see Heather Younger, and her book, The Art of Caring Leadership, just came out, but her previous book was called The 7 Intuitive Laws of Employee Loyalty, which had come out the year before. And then you see below Melissa Hughes with her book, Happy Hour with Einstein. And she also wrote a second book, Happier Hour with Einstein. Now, some of you from the Helena area may recognize Kimberly and Melissa because over the years, the Women's Leadership Network, Helena, has brought these 2 women into Helena to do keynote presentations for our annual conference. So this is in 2019, in February of 2019. And I'm sitting with these 3 amazing women. We're talking just go-getters. And each of them had an interesting thing that had been going on recently. Kimberly was telling us that she had finally gotten in with this speakers bureau. And most public speakers bureaus, they don't really take people who aren't expecting a $10,000 per keynote payment. That's their compensation minimum, is $10,000, because otherwise their fee would cut in. It wouldn't make any sense for them to represent a speaker that makes less than that. And Kimberly had just gotten accepted with a speakers bureau, and they had reached out to her to ask her about a date, whether she was available in late 2019, because they couldn't get Brene Brown. Now, if anyone is familiar with Brene Brown, she is one of the top public speakers in the world. She can demand probably $80,000 for a 1-hour keynote presentation. And she has multiple books out. She's very well known for her work in vulnerability and emotional intelligence. So here's Kimberly being asked to speak at an event because Brene Brown couldn't make it. And then Heather was talking about a new client she had just signed on that was a very big client in Colorado. And Melissa was talking about a TEDx that she had just been accepted for that she was really, really excited about. It was one of the bigger TEDx stages. And I remember sitting there, it was before my book was published. It was before I even had a book in me, as far as I knew. I was already doing some keynotes, but nowhere near at the level that they were doing them. And I remember a moment of almost panic, this what we would call imposter syndrome, where I thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing here with these women? But it passed very quickly, because as they told me their stories, I knew they were feeling just as self-conscious. And it dawned on me that I was exactly where I needed to be in that moment, surrounded by people who were doing what I wanted to be doing, surrounded by women who would do anything to help me get there, that they were ready to pull me up with them. Now, why do we tell stories? Remember, this was one of the first slides from the plenary, but I'm just going to remind you again, because it's so important. This can't be said enough. When we tell a story, we have an opportunity to process the experience. So given the circumstances of last year, one of the things that I've been encouraging my coaching clients to do is to start thinking about individual moments during the pandemic that had big impact on you. So we're going to work through this in the story portfolio in a moment, but we'll just start with this. You will have opportunities to reframe the things that happened last year in a way that creates an opportunity for growth and connection, as opposed to only remembering the sadness, the moments of devastation, the moments of fear and uncertainty. So those things happened. We're not going to sugarcoat them. We're not going to pretend like everything was all right last year, but we are going to find ways to tell those stories that make us feel resilient and strong and brave, because those internal messages are going to stick with us for the rest of our lives. So that's one way. They create strong connections with others, as we've talked about before. And here's what we're going to talk about today more than anything, is that they offer you an opportunity to demonstrate your values, your talents, your ambitions in a way that you don't have to tell people, like on an interview, I'm a team player, because telling people doesn't work. You have to demonstrate it. So let's go back to that first exercise we did earlier this morning. But we're going to start this time with that ultimate goal in mind. So do me a favor and jot down your personal mission statement for the next conversation you're going to have with someone, whether that is a colleague, your kid, somebody, a teller at the bank, whatever it is. Think about what your mission statement is for that conversation, and it will be transferable or applicable to pretty much every conversation you have. Now, jot this down. You may remember that my ultimate goal with every conversation is to leave it better than I found it, so that whoever is in front of me, when they walk away, they feel like they had safety to share, that they feel more confident, and maybe even ready and willing to take the next step and step out of their comfort zone to do something that will change them. So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. Now, this is not a final product, so don't even think too hard about it. Just give yourself a high-level goal for every conversation you have. If you're a leader, well, everyone's a leader in some way. If you're a boss and a supervisor of people, think in terms of what you want to instill in your employee the next time you talk to them. So what's your ultimate goal? And if you want to share in the chat, that would be great. Some of you may have heard me say this before. I don't believe you can separate your personal and professional lives, not if you're bringing your whole self to work every day. So one of the things that you'll see in a lot of my presentations are images of my kids and my dog, because they are a big part of my life. They influence a lot of what I do and how I think. And that's my lab, Toby.
Sarah, we're getting some comments in their mission statements, personal goals.
Okay, can you share like 5 of them for me?
Yeah, to communicate clearly with compassion and kindness, instill trust. People know that the person knows they are loved universally and matter. And they leave the listener with ahas and ha-has, meaning leave them inspired and more joy-filled.
Oh, I love those. Those are so awesome. I'm always so pleasantly surprised when things like that come through. I did have somebody write that people think I'm smart one time. That was actually a goal for somebody. We had to really work through that one. So those were great. So hang on to that as we go through this. And you did this, hopefully you did this exercise during the keynote session, but if you didn't, I'd love for you to do it right now. Think about the 3 words you would want people to use to describe you after an interaction. So I'm putting up a few suggestions here. If you already did this, maybe take a look at your 3 words from the last session and see if any of them pop out to you, or if you want to add any, or if you want to switch any out based on your mission statement that you just wrote down. So these really need to be in alignment. If your goal is to make people feel confident and safe around you, then you're probably going to have to be trustworthy or respectful, compassionate or empathetic. So think about these 3 words in the context of your goal. Now I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to think this through. And if anyone wants to share their 3 words or what their thoughts around this in the context of your goal, Katie, if you can read any of those off to me, that would be great.
Yeah, so far we have compassionate, funny, authentic, warm, kind, compassionate, kind, ambitious, and fun.
Fun. I like that. All right.
Authentic, compassionate, and trustworthy.
Excellent. Excellent. Trustworthy. So when you are thinking about those words and you're thinking about how you're consistently demonstrating them, This is another slide from the previous session. Again, these cannot be reminded enough. I have to remind myself every day of the words that I want people to use to describe me. I think of this in terms of my legacy, because if I'm not living this every day, my legacy isn't my own design. And I'm not a control freak or anything, although I have my moments sometimes, but I do want to influence my legacy. And this is how I do it. Every day, I try to make sure I'm being consistent about it. So I have this poll. Katie, do we have this available?
Yes, it's up.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share because I think it's easier for people to see. So what's the most important part of being a good storyteller? If you were paying attention in the last session, then this should come very easily for you.
We're at 69%, 71% observing the audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can close the poll now, I think.
Okay, it ended with 59% observing the audience, 23% sharing the right details, 18% having a sense of humor, and 9% having epic stories to tell.
Ah, okay. So who was the first person that answered A?
I can't
Observing.
tell that information.
You can't tell? Okay. So at the end of this, I'm going to ask another question, and whoever is the first to answer it, as far as we know in the chat section, I will send them a copy of my book signed, if you're interested in that. All right, so the answer, and some of you weren't paying close enough attention in the first session, the answer is observing the audience. Now, here's the reason. You could be a super engaging storyteller. You could share exactly the right details. You could tell a story that in certain contexts and certain audiences would absolutely light up the room. But if you haven't observed the audience, or you don't know who is in the audience, your best story could fall flat. So one of the things that I do before I'm going to do any kind of keynote presentation or workshop is I start to look at who is going to be in the audience. If it is mixed men and women across the gender spectrum, I'm not going to share a story of labor and delivery of my two boys. If it is a room full of ranchers and cowboys, I'm probably not going to share a story about a fabulous meal I had in Washington, D.C. when I lived there. So observing the audience, knowing a little bit about them is really the key to sharing the most effective and provocative story. So that is always going to be the thing that I'm going to hold on to. And again, remember, we talked about this in the last session, that you have to be a good active listener in order to be a good storyteller. Now, again, some stories are epic and entertaining and wonderful. Until you know what your intention is behind the story, you won't be able to make it especially effective. If your intention is to be entertaining and make people laugh, then think about the story in that context. I always love to make sure that when I'm sharing a story, I generally know how the audience is going to observe or absorb it. And so I'll tell a story about maybe when I first became a mother and the impact of that on my life. That always connects me with my audience in an emotional way. But I try always to share a story that makes people laugh first, because humor always connects us far more quickly than anything else. So being a good listener. Okay, we're going to do a little breakout here because we have 28 people in the room. So we're going to do an activity for active listening. Remember in the last session, I asked you to come up with a rock star moment. And again, if being a rock star doesn't appeal to you at all, and the thought of stepping on a stage and singing makes you break out in a sweat and makes you want to pass out, think of it in terms of a satisfying moment, a moment at work or at home where you realized that you did something that was meaningful, where you walked away either from a project or a conversation or a relationship that made you feel like you did something really right and you're in the right place at the right time and it mattered. Sometimes those conversations don't end the way that you wanted them to end, but you're satisfied with how you handled it. You felt like you were compassionate, that you handled it with curiosity, even if it wasn't received that way. So think about that. And then when we break out into breakout groups, it's going to be 3 people per group, okay? 3 people per group, and each of you is going to take a turn for 3 minutes. You're going to share a 2-minute story, your rock star moment, and leave a little bit of space for the person who is actively listening to ask questions or to draw out their own story or to draw out more detail from your story. So one person will be the storyteller, one person will be the story listener, and one person will be the observer. Now, Katie, we can do breakouts in this, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Okay. So one person shares a story, one person chooses to be the active listener, and the other person observes the other 2 in action. And then after 3 minutes, we're going to switch, and you're each going to take a turn in each of these positions. Now, I'm going to stop my screen share. Are there any questions in the chat about how we're going to do this?
Nope.
Okay, so remember, the most important thing here is the active listening part that we talked about in the first session. This means making sure you're not distracted. If you could turn on your video, that would be great. Make sure you unmute yourself. And in the very beginning, make a choice about who's going to tell the first story and who's going to be the active listener. And then the third person will be the observer. So this is your practice session. And when we come back after about 10 minutes, we will debrief. We're coming back. If you could all mute yourselves, I may ask you to unmute so that you can share your thoughts a little bit about this so we can debrief. Looks like we lost a couple people in the transition. Let's see if people come back. So I'm curious, let's just jump in, and if people come back, that's great. I'm curious, does anybody want to volunteer to tell the group how it felt to be the storyteller with somebody intentionally actively listening to you? Anybody want to share their thoughts about that?
Okay.
Yes, Diana.
It felt good to be heard and also to express my take on those events and that story that I told. And I felt we were engaged with each other. One person's camera wasn't working, but we still made connections, and there was a lot of value there.
Excellent. So it felt different to do it with that intention behind it, right?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Diana. I appreciate that.
You're
okay,
welcome.
who will share how it felt to be the active listener? And did it feel different from when you've just listened without the practice, knowing that you were practicing? Who would like to share? I know somebody out there has activator in their top talents and they want to share.
I'm an activator.
All right.
So as the active listener for the story that I heard, it was a story that I very much could relate to. It was about kindergartners and teaching them remotely this past year, which I have. I'm gonna come to tears. Yeah, but it was about love and just the joy of the kindergarten world, and that they just see things so optimistically and with such love. And so I really, as an active listener, it really got to my emotional core.
Mm-hmm. Probably in a way more substantial than if you weren't practicing active listening with intention. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, yes.
Cool. Do you also have empathy in your top strengths?
Yes, I do.
Yes, she does. Boy, this girl's got it going on. All right. Somebody else want to share what it was like to be an active listener and how that felt different? Yes, somebody raise your hand.
Sarah, this is Diana Holshoe. I will tell you, I got to listen to an amazing story that really inspired me because it was someone who went out to, do something really good in our communities, was faced with obstacles, found creative ways to work around it, and really set up our community for success in the long run on a multifaceted way. And I thought it was I loved listening to the story because even though the person wasn't, like touting their own horn or whatever, I was just like, wow, you did that. It was inspiring to listen to what they had done and how creatively they had, overcome obstacles and solved problems for many people. And it was really inspiring.
So it sounds, Diana, like you already knew this person, but did you feel more strongly connected as a result? Do you think that the practice of active listening made it different?
Yeah, I didn't actually know this person at all.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it was just, it was a whole new experience for me with this person. And by listening to the story, I feel like I have a connection now with them and I am a huge fan. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay,
awesome.
So thank you, Diana. Thanks for sharing. Does anybody remember in that first session when I talked about how people tell stories about you? Do you remember that part? So I'm going to tell you a brief story about my former boss. We had some conflict in terms of how we interact with people. I have a tendency to really focus on people. I am not super touchy-feely. I'm very affectionate, but I'm not like an emotional, sentimental person. And yet, I really work hard to understand people. I describe it as I speak in full sentences while my former boss spoke in bullet points. But I will never forget this moment when we were in a city commission meeting and the commissioners were giving him a hard time about employee salaries. And anyone who has worked in the public sector knows that none of the service providers are getting rich working in a local government agency. And honestly, some of the pay was too low, some of it may have been too high, but overall, generally it worked pretty well. But the comment from these commissioners was that it wasn't sustainable and we should really rethink how we're paying our city employees. And it was really insulting to those of us working for the city at the time, sitting in the room. And I will never forget this moment where my boss actually stood up for us and he said, "I will not let you balance the budget on the backs of my employees." Those were his words. "I will not let you balance the budget on the backs of my employees." It changed my whole relationship with this man. I suddenly had a different form of respect for this man. And we were always respectful to each other, but that changed everything. So the way Diana just told that story probably could change the way somebody feels about that person if she was using names. So think about that. That is powerful. All right. Anything else that people want to share? I'm just going to open this up about your experience either observing the active listening, observing the storyteller, and watching what was happening between them. Anybody want to share something out of that before we move on?
We do have a comment in the chat, Sarah, that Mary was able to listen to Carrie Sharp and realize she is a compassionate person who became self-aware from a situation she could have judged, but put it aside and became encouraging and gave hope. And she was impressed. She was the observer in that scenario.
Oh, that's awesome. Isn't that interesting, the way that you can observe somebody else actively listening and that could change your perception of that person as opposed to the person telling the story? I mean, that to me, again, really powerful stuff. All right, anyone else that would like to share about observing or about being an active listener, how it felt different because it was practice and it was intentional? I'm going to give you about 4 more seconds to decide. And one of the things I talk about when I do the stepping out of your comfort zone workshops that I do is don't regret something you don't do. That's the Mae West quote is, I only regret the things I didn't do. So anytime you have an urge to speak up and you don't do it, and then later you say, oh, I should have said something. Don't let that happen right now. Anybody want to raise your hand?
In the chat, Eileen said, listening well means I could hear a great phrase. Salvador said, we're all in the same boat, just in different seats.
Ah, yay, Salvador. Thank you. And thank you, Elaine, for adding that to the chat. Eileen, thank you for adding that to the chat. Anything else? I'm going to give you 5, 4, 3. All right. Now remember, you can participate at any time. You just ask in the chat if you want to add your comment or a thought about what we're doing here. So this is the debrief that we just did. And I'm going to give you homework here. Other than filling out your story portfolio that we'll talk about in a couple minutes, your homework is to practice this twice in the next 12 hours. So before you go to bed tonight, practice active listening twice with intention. Once either on the phone or on a Zoom call, and once in person. So what I would encourage you to do is, again, just like I said in the last session, make sure that you put your phone face down as a cue for yourself and for the person who you're actively listening to, so that you know you're doing it. One time when I gave this exercise to a coaching client, he did this as his test was with his older son, who was 14 years old at the time. And he told him, he said, Len, I'm going to practice active listening with you. This is what my coach asked me to do. And so I'm asking you to participate with me and help me out here, help me do my homework. And they sat together, knees to knees, and he asked a question, and Glenn gave him the information, gave him a little story. And when I asked what that was like, my coaching client said, Sarah, it was so awkward because my son and I usually just tease each other. We make jokes all the time. We're always kind of lighthearted, and this felt really serious. And he said, but it was really awkward. And I said, what did he say? And he said, well, Glenn said it was really awkward. I said, yeah, I can imagine. How did it feel afterward? He said, it felt really good. Like we dealt with this awkwardness. And I said, so awkward doesn't always have to be bad? Is that maybe where we're coming? And he said, that's right. Awkward isn't always bad. So practice this once with somebody in person and once with either Zoom or telephone. You can even tell them that you need to practice this, and then ask them the question, either what happened in your day that made you feel good about yourself, or tell me a story about your dog, or tell me about a time that things weren't going so well and you managed to pull it out and make it better. So I urge you to try this out and exercise this. I do this really regularly. I specifically tell myself I am practicing active listening because I have a tendency to talk too much. So I have to practice this a lot. All right. Here's evidence. Let me describe this a little bit better. I've been actually reading research around storytelling. And I just interviewed a guy named Christian Jarrett that wrote a book about us being able to choose our personality. And he's a psychoanalyst, he's a PhD, and he just published this book that basically says that certain actions and how you share stories about your identity can shift who you are. Now, think about that for a second. If you think, oh, I am just abrupt, I'm aggressive, that's who I am, deal with it. Okay, that's fine. If that's who you are, that's fine, as long as you're okay with the consequences of that. Because the reality is, when you are aggressive or assertive or a bully, you're not going to be a great leader. people aren't going to follow you because they want to, they're going to follow you because they fear you. And they will never bring their best self to work if they are afraid when they're around you, if you are micromanaging them to death, if you are rude to them, if you dismiss them because they don't know how to do something. They will never bring their best self to work in that case. And so you have to be okay with that if you decide you don't care what people think. There are ways to make gradual changes to that aspect of your personality if you want to, if you choose to with intention. And part of that is how you tell the story about who you are. So I mentioned in my previous session that I never had seen myself as a singer in a rock band. I was classically trained as a musician, as a vocalist. I played a little piano, I played the flute, but I never saw myself singing in rock and roll band. And I remember distinctly being really uncomfortable with it when I first started. I was so self-conscious. It was so uncomfortable to get on the stage. I didn't really speak much into the microphone. I didn't have great presence on the stage because I felt like this wasn't really me. Like it didn't feel authentic. And we know what a big buzzword authentic is right now. And I have this vivid memory of a few months into performing with this band. And I had turned them down at first when they asked me to sing with them because I didn't sing rock and roll. And my drummer even told me that I wasn't rock and roll because I was so uncomfortable with it. But I remember one time I had a boss who was very micromanaging. She was pretty cruel to me. She said things that were really, really hurtful. And one week, it was a particularly bad week with her. And we had a gig at the Silver Dollar Saloon in Butte, and the place was packed. And I remember we had just unveiled a new song, and you'll recognize this. I don't give a damn about my reputation. Oh no, not me. Anyway, Joan Jett, Bad Reputation. And I sang my heart out that night because I was so angry. I had on that full energy. I was so angry. And I'm sweating and I'm looking out. I finished the song and the audience was wild. They were singing with me. They were dancing. They were just up full energy just to match mine. And I remember just trying to catch my breath from singing so hard. And I turned around, I looked at my drummer, and my drummer looked at me. He said, "Now that was rock and roll." So yes, we can change, but we have to tell the story in a way that shows that we are our own guide in changing who we are and how we want to be perceived. All right, we have a little time to get into your story portfolio. What I would love for you to do is think about the tipping points in your life. And by tipping point, I mean, now I don't believe in a light bulb suddenly going on full bright. That just doesn't really happen. But what I do believe is that there are a series of incidents, stories, conversations, situations that happen in our lives that slowly turn that dimmer switch on. So a pivot point might be something like a conversation you had with your father when you were 14 or when you were 18, or it could be somebody else who had a big influence on you. But what I want you to do is think about a specific incident that defines a period in your life. So for instance, when I think of my freshman year of college, I remember I was driving home between semesters from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs in my Bug. It was full of my stuff because I couldn't leave it all in the dorm. And I hit ice and went off the road and flattened one of my tires. Yes, I have more than one flat tire story in my plethora of little gold bug stories. But I remember I called my dad when a police officer stopped, drove me to the Texaco station down a couple miles away. And I called my dad first. And he said, he was so angry. He said, "Why are you calling me? I can't help you. I am a mountain pass away from you and over an hour, and I can't help you. So call AAA. He was so upset. And I said, "Well, okay, Dad, but don't worry, I'm fine." And of course, I'm bawling my eyes out. He said, I'm glad you're okay. Call me when you talk to AAA and when you know what's happening. I was like, okay, you know, trying to catch my breath. And in that moment, I pulled myself together because I realized he was only angry because he couldn't help me. And he, all my life, told me that I needed to understand my resources. I needed to know what I had access to that could help me solve problems. And I had my AAA card right there in my purse. And only AAA could really solve my problem in that moment. So that was a tipping point. That reality that I needed to solve my own problems using my resources at hand. So think about those incidents, and they may not come right to you, but give yourself a little time to start jotting those down. So one of the things that you'll see in the worksheet, if you downloaded it or if you will download it, is that there are categories for your stories. What I like to do is I think about the intention of each of my stories. And of course, I add to my story portfolio all the time. I told the story during the breakout session that I had, because I was part of that, about Mother's Day and how I was so surprised to wake up to both boys in the house. And we are empty nesting, so it was such a pleasant surprise. That's a story. So I'm constantly adding to my story portfolio. I encourage you to think in terms of categories as you build your story portfolio. Start with categories that make sense for your business and your life right now. So maybe a category of stories that demonstrate your character and your values. So when I told the story of being so hungry and being worried about being able to feed my children in the first session, trying to decide between milk and eggs, that story describes my character as being resilient, as being grateful. There are all kinds of other words that you might come up with. Mary Palkovich's story about in the chat just now through her breakout session, that demonstrated the character of the person she talked to. A category to demonstrate your skills and knowledge. You may remember from the plenary session when I talked about being a good cook. I don't have to tell you I'm a good cook if I tell a story about cooking. Telling somebody you're a team player isn't going to be valuable. But if you come up with a story that demonstrates when you were a team player, that will be valuable. Another category, if you want to connect on an emotional level, you may have a story. Let's say that you are trying to inspire somebody who is struggling with being a mom, a first-time mom. And my story would be when we decided to move from Washington, D.C. to Montana, it was all because I was holding my baby in my arms after a full day of work. And I looked down at him and I called my mom. And I couldn't stop crying. And again, I'm not a crier. So my mom was really worried. Why are you crying? And I said, I couldn't speak because I couldn't breathe because I was crying. And it was the tears, the frustration. And I looked down at this beautiful baby boy and I finally got myself together and I said, it's just that now I know how much you love me. And of course, now we're both crying. That was 22 years ago, but I still live it every time that I tell that story. And I guarantee there are people in the audience now that feel it, that understand that depth of feeling that you have when you have a little baby in your life. So connecting on an emotional level, add that to your story portfolio categories, and inspiring action or a change in behavior. When I told the story about singing in a rock and roll band and I started singing for you, that may just inspire somebody to try something that they wouldn't otherwise do. All right, do we have any questions or comments?
There was one comment just when you were talking about your story portfolio that said, I remember my husband coming home with an entire chocolate cake and there was no celebration. It was the first time I realized that as an adult, I could buy and eat chocolate cake whenever I wanted.
That is a great story for your portfolio. I love that. Anything else in there?
Nope, nothing else right now.
Okay. And again, please feel free to join in that chat section. It's how you stay engaged. I know it's almost lunchtime, so everybody's eager to go. And we'll have about 2 minutes after the finish here to ask questions and to connect with me. So one of the things that I always remind people is that you don't have to stay on a muddy path with other people. If you hear somebody complaining and they're just a person that complains all the time, you don't have to get in the mud with them. You can tell a story that separates you from the mud. And whether you're going to reach out and they're going to grab your hand and you can pull them out of it, that's up to them. But just remember that you don't have to spend time there with them. So sharing stories that bring out joy. Again, life isn't always joyful. We do need to start with the reality, the obstacle that we hit, the challenge that we faced. And then the rest of the story, so maybe that's 20% of your story, the next 80% has to be how you got out of it. Who was there to help you? Even if one of these people that you're defining or describing was a horrible person in terms of their treatment of you, sometimes that spite, that choice to move forward is a result of a difficult interaction. So make sure you bring in the other characters in your story. But again, 80% of your story needs to be how you found success, how you found a solution, what your answer was. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have a happy ending, but you need to focus on the lessons. That's how we get out of the mud. I say this a lot. I say this to my children all the time. You are a product of the people you surround yourself with. Now, remember, in the very beginning of this session, I told the story of surrounding myself with these women who were inspiring, who were encouraging, who were building me up. Your stories, when you start seeing patterns in your story portfolio of the people that contributed to your damaging internal messages, the people who contributed to your successes, you'll see these patterns emerge in your story portfolio so that you can be more intentional about the people you choose to spend time with. I have to say this again. This is the key to everything. Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. All right. And we already know that you are an ambassador. We already talked about that. So I would love to answer any questions you may have. If you have anything else you'd like to add to this conversation, I would love to hear it.
There's a couple more stories that popped up in the chat. From Roselle, my young adult memory of my dad, every phone conversation started with him asking, "Are you getting enough to eat? Are you staying warm? And did you check the oil in your car?"
Roselle, that's awesome. I love that.
Spoken like a man who came out of World War II. And
yes.
Brianna shared, "I just had a moment this past Mother's Day when I received a card from my dad that said, 'I'm proud of the way you take care of my grandchildren.' I suddenly felt like I made it in life from that one sentence."
Yes. Yes, Brianna, that's exactly right. When you hear the words from somebody else like that, it gives you the confidence, the evidence, so that when you do something that isn't quite right, that feels out of alignment, you can look back the evidence that shows that you are on the right track, even if you make a mistake here and there.
And then someone asked if you could repeat your book title again, please.
Yes, it's called Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. And it's available on my website, elkinsconsulting.com or Amazon. I love to support bookshop.org, which is a not-for-profit bookseller that actually supports local booksellers. So bookshop.org, if you haven't found that one yet. Love that one.
I just put both of those in the chat for everyone to see too. So
thanks, Katie.
Well,
appreciate
Sarah, we appreciate you. This has been a joy to have you both at our plenary and in a breakout, and we just really appreciate your expertise on storytelling and intentionality. So thank you for taking some time with us today.
Thank you for hosting, Katie. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, for all of you in attendance, thank you for joining us for this session. Again, check out Sarah's work on her website, check out her book. Sarah, there's lots of comments in the chat about appreciating you and thankfulness for you. Remember, again, always you can participate in community conversations through the Whova app to chat more. We will now be heading into a 1-hour lunch break and look forward to having you back in breakout sessions at 1 and our final session at 2:30 today, where we actually get to hear from some emergency housing assistance program clients who will tell their story. So we get to actively listening to some clients we serve. So we appreciate you all. We thank you, and we hope you have a great lunch break.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.